Welcome, friends. Welcome to this AEA webinar. We are going to have a pretty awesome informal conversation today with three good friends of mine. Yeah, you're all good friends. None of you is being excluded. And Jim, you'd probably be being the longest, having known each other the longest, you'd probably be on the short end of the list if there was a list, but there isn't. So,
Almost 10 years now.
yeah, it's been a while. So, welcome everyone. I have joining me here today Jim Dunlop, who is um, we've been working together now for almost 10 years, as you just heard, but it's probably been half that time as an AEA consultant. Previous to that, he was helping to manage an orchard operation that we worked with. And Boe Clausen and Stephen Bierlink, which many of you, I think, have heard of both of them before in other webinars and other presentations. So really excited to have all you guys here. Thank you for being here. The purpose of the conversation today, well, we were given some direction. We had the liberty of choosing to follow it or choosing to ignore it. But what we were asked to talk about is, what does transition look like? As we all know, we're all on our own journey. I had my own journey of getting the 2x4 in the face moment of having successive crop losses and crop failures, and then observing the opportunity and observing the potential to grow plants that were resistant to diseases and insects. And that really drove my transition. But all of us have a transition. And I think the conversation we want to have today is there's kind of two aspects to this. What does a transition or step-by-step journey to regenerative agriculture look like just in general overall? And then how does that look like specifically with when you're working with advancing eco-agriculture, and what does that, how does AEA help that transition, and how do we support you along that pathway? So that's the point of the conversation. You're welcome to ask any questions at any point. Just type them into the Q&A. I'm going to be monitoring that and asking your questions out to the folks that we have here. And with that, I'm going to ask three guests that we have here with us to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about their journey and their transition, of what that looked like and what the key drivers were for them. So, Jim, I'm going to turn it over to you. Tell us a little bit about what your journey has been like in participating with regenerative agriculture in general and AEA in particular.
Yeah, well, I was lucky enough to work with Mike Omeg on his cherry orchard, and I was basically managing a lot of the more biological farming things that Mike was doing, and he was working with AEA at the time, so I got to meet all you guys. And I'm not much of a salesperson, but if I believe in something and I know it works, it's not hard for me to sell it. And so we had just huge successes out there at Mike's in the Dalles, Oregon. It would seem like almost every week during the season, Mike would be calling me to tell me about some thing that he had never seen before in the orchard. And after working with Mike, I came on with AEA. I've been here about 5 years. I live in Mosier, Oregon. I do a lot of my work in Eastern Washington in person with these two guys here and other folks. And then we do a lot of work in Idaho, Montana, and BC on Zoom, and just talking, working remotely with those guys. And out here now, we work on a lot of tree fruit, our team here. We work on apples, cherries, and pears, and a lot of blueberries, a lot of organic blueberries. We're getting into a lot of dryland wheat and potatoes. And I like working on potatoes. They're one of my favorites. And now I'm into corn. I'm into corn now that we're working with Beau. We hadn't done a whole lot of corn out here in the PNW. And we started with Beau this last year, and I think it's fair to say we're off to a good start on the corn. So, and then we've done some great stuff with Stephen too. I'm sure he'll talk about that. Stephen had started working with us before I came on, so he had been working with Jason Stoll for a couple of years prior to me coming onto the team, and I was lucky enough to take over that account and work with Stephen and share in some of the glory that we've had out there with just incredible yields on Honeycrisp and really good quality and that kind of thing.
Jim, I'm going to throw you a curveball before I move
Oh
on.
boy,
Uh,
my favorite.
what is as you help farmers who are just getting started or just going down this pathway, what are the important things that you look for as a consultant? What are the important things that you look for that you believe are indicative of a farm's potential for success?
You can kind of tell if somebody has a well-organized farm and whether they're the type of person to get it done. For the most part, if we work with a grower and they do the program, they're going to have success. And the times that we don't have success are when growers just basically aren't getting the program done. They're not getting the foliars done in a timely manner, that kind of thing. So a lot of it is just kind of innovative guys that already have kind of a good program going, and have, you can just kind of tell when you drive up to the farm, are things organized. And both these guys have, pretty amazing farms. They're very different, but really nice farms.
Thanks, Jim. Beau, we'll go over to you. Tell us a little bit about your story of your introduction to regenerative agriculture and your process of starting to work with AEA and what some of the highlights have been for you.
Yeah, my process started, I guess, not searching for regenerative ag, but issues with nutrient availability. So we have a feedlot, and manure is our main source of nutrition. And besides that, we're mostly using nitrogen, sulfur for our fertility. But like I say, we're still having great success with manure, but noticing there were some of the microbes and some of the nutrients that were not available. And we're kind of questioning why they're not. And reality is we don't have a good understanding of our soil's health and that it's a living being, and we weren't treating it as such. And so going down this longer road, then we are in our operation. We're I call it hay, grain, cattle operation. We swapped ground with a neighbor farm for many years, over 25 years for potatoes production. So about every 5 years, a neighbor would put potatoes on our ground, and in so doing, they would come in and fumigate the ground and grow a potato crop, and then and so on. And so once out of every 5 years, our ground was fumigated, and it was just kind of standard practice for our area, and so we accepted that. And but we noticed that having issues where they call it even earthworms is a simple sign that we did not have earthworms until just prior to potatoes going in the ground, and we would typically see them in some of our fields, our alfalfa fields particularly. We would see earthworms coming in, and then they would disappear again, and we just kind of accepted we just don't have that high of earthworm population in our area, and that was it. It just, you look across the fence, and that's the way the neighbors looked, and you accept it. But so in the same time being, when they started questioning that it did not like the idea of fumigant, the potato grower was working with Jim in AEA, and so the farm manager there sent me a link to a podcast, and then I remember sitting there listening to it and question, and like I think it was on the fallacy of potassium applications, mainstream nitrogen potassium applications. And I listened to it, and it's like, man, this made sense, but it was just totally opposite of what I've been taught from my local agronomist and area, what we've been practicing. So anyways, as I don't know how many times I listened to that, and then I started listening to more and more of it, those podcasts when I had time running around the farm. And it started striking a nerve on quit looking above the plant, started looking underneath the roots, started looking at soil to life, and so that was I'm going to say my inspiration there is start digging down in the soils, and at the same time I was putting my head down in the soil thinking, okay, this is what I got to fix. Then John Kempf comes up with another podcast that's talking about foliars. No, feed the plant, and the plant will feed the soil. Get back up again, and it says, now where do I go? So, but anyways, as you listen, it made more and more sense on the direction of plants are smarter than we are, and they know what they need. And as long as you treat that plant well in a short term, it will treat the soil well. And if the soil is treated well, the biology will do well, and then the circle of life continues. And And so it's been I'm going to say I think I'm starting to get the full picture of the principles and how to apply them, but it's a never ending learning process. So that's oh yeah, quick, not so quick. How I got to where I am from, I call it a more of a heavy manure conventional farmer to going to just almost. I probably on some of my fields went to less than 10% of my inputs on my fields, and basically trying to cut out all. Most of my pesticides are all being cut out, and my macros of fertility are being cut out, other than manure. But on my most successful fields I had on my wrinkled seed peas, beet, triticale, even pasture ground, cover crops, and of course corn as basis. My volume of nutrients I applied last year were probably closer to 10%, and half of that was in financial value. So I cut my inputs by half, and but only a tenth of the inputs. But the kicker is my soil health on my soil fertility as a standard is not diminishing. It's actually still coming up to this day. I took soil samples a couple of weeks ago on some of my fields. My fertility levels are still coming up. And I've heard that, and people talk about it and all that. And I have not done anything drastic in my mind. And I've only done the simple. I've only reached picking out the low hanging fruit of reducing my volume of inputs and just focusing on with the help of, like, say, Jim on these steps, and focusing on inputs that just to balance that plant for the, even just call it a short term. But when you get a plant balanced for a short term, it just priming the system, and it can take off on its own then, and that's all it needs. So that's kind of where I'm at today.
Yeah, Beau, the podcast episode that you referred to was the one that in which I interviewed Rick Mulvaney. Was titled "The Potassium and Nitrogen Fallacy" or something like that. And one of the listeners to the podcast sent me a message afterward, and he said he thinks that's the single most influential podcast episode for agriculture ever recorded.
Wow.
It's changed some operations in some very significant ways up in the Canadian prairie. So that's really had an impact. Beau, I want to come back and ask you in more detail about some of the specific practices that you've done, and I'd love to get your thoughts and dig into that a bit deeper. But let's go to Stephen. Stephen, tell us a bit about your operation, and obviously you've Stephen. For those of you who haven't listened to Stephen before, he's one of those guys whose mind never stops asking questions. He's always wondering, what if we did stuff different?
Yeah, that's right. I was thinking about that earlier, actually, and where does the inquisitiveness come from? And I had a fourth grade teacher, and I've always remembered this. She would not allow us to say "I can't" in class, and that really irritated me as a 10-year-old. But I think that mindset has carried a lot of how I think now. So when I ask somebody, well, how do you do this? And it's a standard answer, especially for a lot of things in ag, they'll say you can't. And then my attitude to that is, well, watch this, and let's find a way. There is a way. So focus on the solution after you figure out what the solution is, and then figure out the means to get there. And don't accept things like you can't. And I think that's what led me to John, because I was looking for other people who would say the same and think the same. And that's really where it started. I wasn't happy with the results I was seeing, the packouts I was getting, and the general lack of explanation. Basic education in agriculture, I don't want to demean an ag degree by any stretch, but it's very different than once you're on the farm. I don't have an ag degree, but I would say I've been able to learn just as much, at least in what I do, by doing my own research. And that's why I'm such a big proponent of people doing their own research and finding out for themselves. And it's not, then again, also that consultants are not perfect in every way, and neither are we, but it's our responsibility to try to, as farmers, we have to be the best at what we do for the crops we grow on our ground and with our management styles. And so a lot of it is trying to figure out, how do I write my own instruction book for my crops on my farm with my practices? And it was an easy way to have AEA fall into that for me, because it was results based, it was data based, and we're looking at all the results with a critical eye, rather than just saying the book says this is what the result should be. This was looking at the actual result and then saying, how did that happen? And does it make sense? And then how do we adjust so that we can get the desirable results in the future, regardless of what the book says? And John, I think it was on a poster that, or maybe it was just a saying that you had said at some point, but yeah, when what you see disagrees with what the book says, you throw the book away. And that is
that's very
huge,
uncomfortable for a lot of people.
it is. And that's what's difficult, is it takes an incredible amount of energy to critically think for yourself, and to open yourself up to the idea that you may have very likely done something wrong in the process. But by doing that, then you can identify where the problems were and figure out a way to do it better. So SAP analysis is a good tool for that, because you can see the results, figure out how you need to adjust, and then coming up with new ideas, rather than looking at something and saying, well, what does the book say about this? It's like, well, most of the books aren't going to have stuff about regenerative ag. And if they do, it's going to be a short section, and it probably won't be very historical in terms of formal education. Formal education in ag goes against a lot of regenerative practices. And that was the pushback that I found when I was first looking into AEA and talking about SAP analysis, asking questions to people that were educated at university level, and they were very dismissive of it. And that made it really difficult to find information. But there was an obvious aura around it and legitimacy to it. So it seemed to make sense to look into it a little bit deeper. And that's when I made some calls, and we've seen some great successes since then.
Stephen, hearing you describe the process, a few thoughts come to mind. One of them is that one of several of my mentors who come from an academic background have very clearly communicated that, John, you could not have learned what you now know in an academic environment.
That's right.
So there is no replacement for actually learning about what's going on in your operation. And I think the comment you made about this philosophy or this approach seems to make sense is fundamentally it boils down to first principles thinking, like understanding the foundational principles of plant physiology and soil and plant microbe interactions and nutrient interactions. When you have those foundational principles, you say, well, wait a minute, this picture is painted over here about how nutrition works, but I can take these exact same colors and the exact same interactions and come up with a very different picture. And it takes some intellectual rigor to develop that and to follow your own pathway and describing what that new vision should look like. Stephen, for those of our listeners who haven't listened to you or heard of you before, which I'm imagining there's a few, can you give us just a quick context of your operation, crops you're growing, and your transition, what your transition pathway has been like over the last half a dozen or more years?
Yeah, it's 75 acres of apple orchard, and probably 400 acres of row crop. That's alfalfa, sometimes wheat, sometimes corn, sometimes beans. It's just whatever fits the bill. I started noticing a long time ago that while I enjoy doing row crops more, there was not the profit margin available in comparison to fruit. And I did not want to have a massive orchard. So I thought, can I maintain relevance with a smaller amount of land and doing a better job by paying attention to more details, since I'm detail oriented anyway? So I started doing that, didn't get the results I wanted, even with all the data and all the details. So by incorporating regen practices, products and info from AEA, and making that as a whole, I was able to get to a point where now I would say the orchard, even though it's 20% of the acres, probably covers 85 to 90% of the total revenue. And that means that I should be spending 85 to 90% of my time there. So, like I said, I still really enjoy doing row crop stuff. There's something nice about being in a tractor and going back and forth, and whether it's working dirt or cultivating corn or whatever, I like adjusting equipment and things like that. But what I'm better at than that is management practices in the orchard on a detailed level. So AEA has really helped me do that by having the right products, by having the right information through SAP analysis and its interpretation. I think Beau touched on that. The interpretation of the data is very often more important than the data itself, because it doesn't matter how much data you have if you can't crunch it. So knowing how to do all that has really helped out. And then as you gain a little bit of success in that area, after you try something that you want to be detail oriented, a few small successes come. That's what provides the motivation and the confidence to continue on that path and go farther with it. And then it's this positive feedback loop. The higher the successes get, the more confidence you have, and the more ideas you're willing to try. And so at this point, it's still in this really great, beneficial, positive feedback loop. And I don't know what the potential upside is for the future. That's why it's a really exciting time to be in ag and to be part of this regen thing. Is we don't know the limits of, and it doesn't matter if it's just apples. It could be any crop, but the goal could be, well, we just want to make healthier products for people, or the goal could be we want more money. But those are the same thing. Right. A better, more quality product is going to store better. It's going to be better every way. Yeah,
and it's better not just for the producer, it's better not just for the consumer, but it's also better for the supply chain, the distribution supply chain. Like when we think about the amount of fresh produce that gets lost in the supply chain due to spoilage, it's, what is it? I think upwards of 40% for most fruits and vegetables. It's a big number.
Yeah. That's very significant when you're dealing with something that can provide 90% of your income.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Stephen. Beau, I'd like to come back to you. As you have been going down this pathway, what surprised you, or what was unexpected? What's been unexpected on your journey?
Nitrogen use and needs is that's the big one. I mean, that's my whole farm was based off of nitrogen demand. When I had I call it a plenty manure, so my P and K numbers are always great. Nitrogen was my biggest needs, and all of a sudden I felt my biggest shortcoming that I had to need it on my farm was nitrogen. All of a sudden, meeting up with Jim, and he starts explaining, "No, you don't need it, and it's okay. I'm sure we were over applying too much at one time in that, and then but for the reality to go from what I tried with applying, I'm going to say 300 plus pounds of nitrogen applied in a season on a corn crop to 20 pounds applied in the same results from my commitment compared to it in the same year, exact same yields, and it did not make sense. So it threw me off. So yeah, when I looked at nitrogen, that was the biggest factor, because I mean we're all taught just to follow nitrogen. So but luckily, like say Jim, I remember we had him pull SAP and start reading it and looking at the numbers and saying, no, you're fine. Your total nitrogen's fine. Your total nitrogen's fine. And it's like, well, usually we were putting on 100 pounds of nitrogen now, and he's like, nope, wait. And then finally, the corn's at B10 and at the rapid growth stage, and we should have had 250 pounds plus of nitrogen applied for that crop available for it to take off and go. And he says, okay, yep, I think you can go ahead and foliar apply a little bit. And I says, well, okay, how much were you thinking? Like 10, 20 pounds? It's like, A couple pounds, good, maybe no more than 5 pounds. It was like 5 pounds. I mean, it's not even gonna know you get anything. It's like, no, it'll be fine. and so okay, so we went ahead and tried it, and we kind of nervous, so I pulled tissues again, still doing tissues, and then we pulled saps and look at it, and all of a sudden numbers take off, and it was and where they need to be, and it's like, man, okay, as long as well, how do you put it? He was interpreting the numbers and where they should be. I didn't understand that, but he could look at them and say, okay, well, where we need to be. And it's like, well, it could have been smoke and mirrors, and he could have told me that that I could have been way off and didn't even know it. But I still go back and look at the crop, and a corn crop visually will tell you when you're shorting a nitrogen. And we did that all season, and never seen the deficiency of nitrogen till the very end of the season, into early October. And the crop was just pretty much done before we could see a little bit of nitrogen deficiency showing up. And usually we're getting a little bit of senescing at that time on the lower leaves, and that's what was showing up. So it was nothing out of the ordinary. And so that was odd.
So Beau, if I put on the hat of a skeptic, I haven't been to your farm. I don't know anything about your soils and what you've been doing there. But I think the obvious question that a skeptic would ask is, well, did you have a history of surplus of nitrogen in that soil profile the crop was tapping into, that you were able to pull that nitrogen out?
Yes. So the one crop that let's say that was simple was following alfalfa hay. So we followed it. We had 3 years of alfalfa hay, and virtually no nitrogen applied on alfalfa. There was a little bit of diasol to get a little bit of sulfur. One season before, I think 4 gallons of diasol. Otherwise, but if you look on the soil test, my total available nitrogen was between 45 to 75 pounds available in the soil prior to planting in that alfalfa. And I did take 2.5 tons of alfalfa off prior to putting in the corn. And then I took 7 tons of dry corn off. So I took off 9.5 tons of dry matter, and in one season, and my inputs were call it 20 pounds of nitrogen to maintain, and I call it an.
Did you say 40 pounds?
20. Yeah, 20 pounds. So when you look at that nitrogen use efficiency, is kind of a nice keyword too. I'm under 10. So I got call it between 250 to 300 bushel on this 280 acre fields, and we had applied 20 pounds of nitrogen. So anybody can do the math. And if you wanted to add that, I took total soil available nitrogen and utilize that also, I'm still under 0.4. But then I took soil samples after the crop, and all my nitrogen was still there. And so soil was down to a certain level, call it getting between 45 to 75 pounds of total available nitrogen. I'm going to say that's probably a balance point in my soils. That alfalfa crop had done that, balanced it out, and that's where it needed to be with the legume crop. And so it's maintaining there. But then the next thing was I took soil samples again here 2 weeks ago, and just out of curiosity, and they were come up. 3 out of the 4 were higher. 1 was equal, and 3 out of the other 4 nitrogen values are coming up higher than they were prior. So it's changing my whole mindset on.
When you say they're higher than they were prior, as in higher than they were before you planted a crop, or higher than they were after the crop?
Both.
Both.
So, fall sample is 1, and then I took a fall sample of 22, and then a spring sample in 23, and my nitrogen levels have been rising. Each time they're rising, and say I took also on removal rates, I took off 9.5 tons of dry matter that I removed from dry alfalfa hay to dry grain corn, and with only 20 pounds of applied nitrogen.
The perennial skeptic says, how many years can you do that before you exhaust the supply?
Right.
Yeah. No, but it's so no, like I said, I threw my books.
John, I have a question for you. I don't work on a lot of corn, so this seems pretty far out to me, but you've worked on a ton of corn. What do you think of this? 20 pounds of nitrogen and 250 to 300 bushels of corn.
I think the context and the environment is important. I've observed similar results a couple of dozen times, but in every single case, in fact, there's a couple of, I might even have a couple of short video clips on YouTube from a farm that I visited in Kansas a couple of years ago. It's an organically certified farm. They're dry land, so they're doing no cover crops. It's corn, summer fallow, corn, summer fallow, corn. No cover crops, no manure application, no compost application. Like there's no way for nitrogen to get into that system except through biological fixation. And they're growing, it's very moisture dependent, of course, but anywhere from 125 to 215 bushels of corn per acre in a season, depending on moisture levels, with no nitrogen application. Well, when I say no nitrogen application, they might be getting a gallon or two of Sea Shield. That's the extent of the nitrogen going into the system. And in every single case, when you have these farms that have these exceptional nitrogen fixation stories, the ones that I'm personally familiar with all have a history of intensive manure application at some point in their past. Just as the situation that you had, Beau. This farm in Kansas hadn't applied manure for, I think, 12 or 15 years. But prior to that, they had really intensive manure applications for the better part of a decade. So I think there's something going on in the background there. We don't tend to get quite as significant of a response when there isn't that history of historical manure applications. But so Jim, it's in soils that don't have those manure application history, we still see nitrogen applications cut down by 70% or better.
Yeah.
So this is still not a surprise. See, what we have to remember about corn is a C4 photosynthetic pathway plant, and it fixes carbon and moves sugar into the root system in a volume that is unmatched by most crops. There's very few crops that move as much sugar into the rhizosphere. And so that means it can feed biology to fix a tremendous amount of nitrogen.
Got it.
I'm speaking on that. I believe I heard it from you that you mentioned that it could be up to 30,000 pounds of sugar root exudate from a corn crop.
Possible, yes.
I heard that. I've been searching for it here this last month to figure out where, and I believe it was I heard it from you anyways. But that's something that I'm going to say that has struck me as just key on our soils with growing corn, that 30,000 pounds of sugar feeding soil biology, and the carbon, call it a cycling that we're getting from that is hard to compare to anything else.
Yep. I think the some of the original references that got me starting to do the extrapolations and the math was Don Schrieffer. He has two books. One of them is titled Agriculture in Transition, and the second one is titled From the Soil Up. And both pretty interesting reading. He had a completely different take and different perspective on how we should be managing soils for a root bed. He detested the term seed bed. He said, we're not making a seed bed, we're making a root bed. So he had a really different way of looking at what was happening with soil dynamics. Jim, I'm going to flip the question back to you. What was for you as a consultant, what was the process like of working with Beau as he starts doing crazy stuff?
Well, we had dabbled with Beau the year before. I think it was a mite spray that we put together for him, and I think he was pretty happy with that. And Beau does this competition corn growing and everything, and he does a lot of trials for DeKalb, and he's the kind of guy that can kind of keep everything straight. And I just knew that this guy was going to get it done. And I don't know how many hours we sat together over the winter talking Beau. I stopped by there and we talked for 3 hours each time. I'd leave in the dark and that kind of stuff all through the winter. But like I said, Beau was already growing his corn really well, and he's a super competitive guy in that. And I think it's a big part of who he is, growing corn and what he's into. And yeah, I guess all those things made me realize like he was somebody that I wanted to spend some time with and put some energy and effort into. And I'll say this, Beau took it to a whole new level than anything that I never that I would have expected. I didn't think that he was going to do exactly what he did, so I was pretty impressed.
Beau and Stephen, I think two of the things that you share in common, one of the facets that we've described very as fundamental, or as I shouldn't say as fundamental, but is directly correlated to the degree of a grower's success, is what I just call management intensity. Being on the ball is fundamental too, because it's this really is a difference in mindset and focusing on preventing problems rather than fixing them after they happen. And that takes a high level of awareness to be aware of all the problems that could potentially come up in the future. So,
yeah.
Stephen, I'm going to come back to you. What, as you went down this pathway, what surprised you and what was unexpected for you?
That's a good question. There have been so many surprises and things being flipped on their head. I still have some things that I did pre AEA, and I have to challenge myself to look at those things again and say, does this really hold relevance still? And because everybody has, well, I do this because it works. Okay, well, you break this down to the individual things that you're doing to find out what works. And then it's like, are those things actually working? There's a ton of things. Probably the biggest was fungicide applications have been cut down to nearly nothing. And some of that is based on environmental, and the tree is healthier. And so we don't have to worry about it as much. And some of it is me just kind of realizing, why am I trying to kill things all the time? I should be trying to grow things. And even if it's bugs. So it's like, all right, well, if I don't want to kill those bugs, then what's the option? Put good bugs out there, or at least make it friendly for them. So that's really changed my mindset a lot, because now I can say, hey, there's a bunch of aphids everywhere. Well, let's hang out and wait and see if the ladybugs show up. And they do. Okay, good. Because we didn't make it hostile to the ladybugs by spraying a bunch of stuff out there. So go ahead, have the food source, then wait for the ladybugs. Okay, so they do that. And the same is true for soils. Stop putting all these things on the soil that are antagonistic to soil microbiology. Use different products that don't have that, and then add more good bugs. And let's see what that does. So that was a huge surprise. Fire blight was probably the most impactful, because I can see it through the long term. Everyone in my area is deathly afraid of fire blight, because in apple trees, it's like tree cancer. So there's all these antibiotic sprays that it could rain really hard when it's blooming, or if you get hail, any sort of damage to tissues. And we assume that the bacteria is around, that it's just there. It may be laying dormant. So by using all the products that I use, and talking to Jason Stoll about this on the front side, I could see his tin hat over the phone. I was like, yeah, no way. But I didn't want to believe it at first, but I had to put some trust in it, because everything that came out of his mouth made perfect sense. So it's like, okay, well, if you can't argue with it, then you have to test it. And the more I tested it, the more I trusted it. So fire blight was something that came up every once in a while, and sometimes it would become a little bit of a problem. But through the years, I haven't sprayed anything for fire blight for many years now. And I still have some feeling of nervousness, because I hear all the other sprayers going, and I know what they're doing. And I still have like some doubt in my head, but it's not anywhere close to enough to make me want to go buy those products and apply them. So I haven't seen fire blight in my orchard for at least 6 or 7 years. It's just not there, because the trees are healthy, and you don't need to worry about it. It's if you were to have a child indoors for 10 years and suddenly let them outside, yeah, they're going to get sick every single time they encounter anyone. But you expose them to some things and you make sure they eat healthy and you raise them right, and they'll have their own immune system built to fight those things for themselves. And plants are the same. So the fire blight thing was probably one of the gateways to helping me understand more about how biology works in terms of a plant's relationship with the environment that it's in.
Thanks, Stephen. We have a couple of questions here for you, so I'm going to jump right into them. The first one is from John Warmerdam, who, if you haven't met, I should introduce the two of you. John's a stone fruit grower from California. He says, big respect and a fist bump. How do you gauge your tree's health to hang the extra crop to get the yields you have achieved? And this follow-up question is, did you see biennial bearing after 150 plus bushel bin per acre crop?
I'll answer the second question first. Yes.
Yes.
Yes. And it was extreme. And we kind of knew that was going to happen. Biennial bearing is really, really difficult to prevent. You have to have a really, really consistent on biennial bearing varieties. It's really difficult to mitigate that crop load. And if the weather doesn't agree with your thinning practices early on, bloom time thinning, it's already so late in the season that it's almost impossible to make any adjustments to that crop load in terms of next year's crop. You can do it for this year's crop, but you can't do it for next year's crop unless you're very, very early. So in 2020, that we knew that we didn't have good thinning weather during bloom time. And we knew that was going to mean it was going to be a huge crop. So we did everything we could to get as much as we could off early. And after that, it's just, okay, what's here is here. So then the next step was, let's see if it's possible to bring what's here to maturity, because it was such a huge crop load, knowing that we probably wouldn't have much the next year. So the average on honeys, like a 5-year average for me, is probably right around 105 bins per acre or so. But that comes with ups and downs. So it's some of the planning process is for next year's crop, and some of it's for this year's crop. And there's certain concerns you have to take for making sure that you bring this crop for this year to harvest. And then there's other concerns that you can have for what happens next year. But there's a certain time frame that passes that you can say, I can't concern myself with what's going to happen next year anymore, because whatever you do won't have enough of an influence to impact that. And so you just have to let that go. And the rest happens by making sure you focus on this year's crop without letting concerns about next year's crop happen. It's like, tomorrow has its own problems. Let those happen when you wake up tomorrow. And you can't do anything about it today. So whatever, put it in a box, put it to the side, and open it tomorrow morning.
Even I think one of the key comments that you're inferring is the earliness of which bud determination for the following year's crop is
Yes.
influenced. And that's
Yes.
something we've done a really good job of managing as compared to many growers who are not paying attention.
Yeah. Could you reread the first question? I don't want to butcher that one.
Yeah, the first question was, how do you gauge your tree's health to hang the extra crop to get the
Yeah.
yields achieved?
Yes. So the time that you have to spend out in that crop is a huge factor in that, because we've talked about this in other formats before. But if the trees could talk, or if a plant could talk, what would it say? How does it feel? Obviously,
They can talk. We just can't hear them.
Sure. Right. Yeah. So it's a different language, but you can tell. One of my things when I go out to the orchard is, do things seem happy? Do the trees look happy? And prior to me making a lot of these changes, they kind of looked like they were on steroids. But that doesn't mean they're healthy. Just because they're growing a lot doesn't mean they're healthy. So that's why I used the steroids idea, because it's like, yeah, they were growing a ton, but it wasn't putting the energy into something productive. So knowing that you have a good base for the crop to say, okay, are there good strong buds prior to bloom? How big are they? And then when the blooms come out, do they actually have 5 full petals, and are they big, or are they small little flowers? The small little flowers are going to come probably from smaller buds, and they're probably going to be weaker because they don't have as much energy. They'll be easier then to thin, whether chemically or even organic thinners too. So if they're going to thin easier, you have to go a little easier on them. And once you have the crop set and you know that you're in this cell division stage, looking at the tree at that point, because that's an incredibly stressful time for the tree. Do the trees still look healthy during that time? It's really hard to get a sap sample big enough when the leaves are, an inch wide and maybe an inch and a half long. You have to get a lot of leaves to get a good sap test of that. But that information early is incredibly valuable. And so by having a history of several years of those sap tests early on, now I kind of have a roadmap where I can say, I know the nutrients that are deficient on my farm early on. And so I can front load that with way more applications. A lot of times it feels like you're not doing much because it's like, geez, there's not even hardly any foliage out here. Well, maybe not, but there are a lot of those nutrients that get absorbed through the bark. And what doesn't end up on that will end up somehow in the leaves, the small amount of leaves. And that's okay. So once you know you have your crop size, then you have to just determine, what can I actually grow here? If you know that there's way too much fruit, is your trellis going to fall over? Is it going to break branches? That's the point where you have to start considering, how much do I need to take off here? There definitely is a pipeline to every tree trunk or every stem. And there's a certain amount of energy that can pass through that. And if you try to feed too many pieces of fruit with a small pipeline, it's just not going to work. So part of it is intuition through experience, and then just trying to gain whatever, again, if the tree could talk or if the plant could talk, what would it say? And trying to adjust your mindset to process it differently that way.
Stephen, since you're speaking of decision making and how you make decisions, we have a question that's directly relevant to that. And then, Beau, I have some questions for you as well. Stephen, the one question that has come through from Tia is, hi Tia, how did you decide to cut back on fire blight and fungicide sprays? What information was a part of your decision-making process?
That was talking to Jason Stoll, and he had told me that they could cure fire blight, or the AEA could cure fire blight. And I'm like, yeah, this is snake oil. But it was biologically backed, saying, well, look, we know how this bacteria acts. And I had done a ton of research on fire blight prior to this. And I thought, okay, well, if I can get enough of the good stuff to fight that off, if we get a bacterial infection as a human, your body very likely can fight that off. But there are some times that you can't, and you need to take some course of antibiotics. Very healthy people generally do not need to have those medications near as often, because they have stronger systems and they can fight that off naturally. And plants are the same. And so if we can bolster the plant's ability to naturally fight those things off by giving it what it needs when it wants it, that provides some level of confidence to make the first decision to not spray. It isn't a retroactive thing. You don't say, oh, well, I'll only spray those things, if a fire blight event occurs. I think that would be foolish. You could, if you get stuck in a scenario where you have no other choice, it's better to do it later than not at all. But if you're already doing it, you're basically saying, I've already bolstered the tree's immune system to the point where I really don't know that I need to be concerned with it. So after the first time, I was very nervous that I might see some strikes out there. So I was watching very, very closely and didn't see anything. And that's where the confidence came for the next time a fire blight event occurred to say the same. And then the more times you make a decision and the more times it's reinforced by not having an adverse effect, the more confidence you'll have to do it the next time. And so far as that's been, I don't know how many years now, I can continue to confidently make that decision because the same result happens. And that's the basis, honestly, for me, that I think confidence comes from expected results happening.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Stephen. Going down the fire blight earthworm hole is probably a year and a half ago, or maybe even longer. I really went down the earthworm hole looking at fire blight, and somewhere floating around, I have a 40-page document of notes and references. And one of the articles that I found in the peer-reviewed literature kind of really raised my eyebrows. It was published in the late 1960s, if I recall correctly. And there was one sentence that really caught my attention, and it said, if the sucrose content of the nectar within the flower is greater than 24%, Erwinia cannot survive in that environment. It's like, wait, what?
Very specific statement.
Very specific. And if that was known that long ago, why are we not obsessing over that? Why are we not focused on that as a possible pathway of prevention? So,
well, you can't sell any product that way. That's the preventatives. The retroactive products that you would spray after an event, after an infection period. You can't sell any of those products. So here's my tin hat.
Yeah.
Thanks, Stephen. There's a question for Beau here from Joseph. We're looking at a huge biochar facility being established near here. They are talking about adding nitrogen to the char through using it in a feedlot first. I'm assuming they're going to be adding it to the manure in a feedlot. I'm worried that antibiotics would ruin that approach. Do you use antibiotics or still have a feedlot?
Yes. So we have a feedlot that it's actually leased out to a large commercial feeder. So they're feeding around 10,000 head running capacity anyways on it. And so we have first right on the manure. Yes, antibiotics are used only when needed on the cattle. But yes, they are used. I have not noticed any issues or anything on that forefront on the manure from antibiotic use in the cattle. So, and same with our own livestock herd too. Yes, we use antibiotics only when needed. So yes, I mean, so like anything else, we prefer not to if we don't have to. But when the animals are sick, we have issues, outbreaks, we will go and treat cattle. But I have not seen any detrimental effects from antibiotics. And honestly, I believe it's something that you will see further down the road than I am at currently in my regenerative practices. I think when you get further down in you call it even a better state than my soils or my farm is, then I think some of those, I'm going to call it micromanaging issues come up and you will notice it. But right now, I'm not seeing issues.
Yeah, and I think if I were to add to that, I would look at it from the flip perspective to say, well, if we have manure that has antibiotics added to it or in the livestock, then the best way to bind those antibiotics and prevent them from being a problem could be to bind them with char. So I would actually see that being as a net positive rather than a potential negative. Thank you, Beau. Stephen, you're proving to be quite the entertainer today. There's a few more questions directed towards you here. I'll start with Willie's question. Hi, Willie. Can you give us an overview of your regenerative agriculture practices in your apple orchards? And specifically, how do you manage for bitter pit if you have this as an issue? Come on, Willie. He's an AEA customer. Bitter pit is no longer a problem.
I wish that were true. Yeah, bitter pit's one of those things that used to be the number one concern by a long shot. And I always looked at bitter pit as something that was just a calcium deficiency. And it's way more than that. It's so much more than that. It's a calcium related disorder. So calcium needs to be at the right levels in the fruit, but other nutrients also need to be at their correct respective levels also. The best way to prevent bitter pit is to get as much calcium as you can into the fruit prior to cell division tapering off. Because cell division isn't something that just goes at the beginning and stops. You know, we go from cell division really, really hot and heavy on the front end, and it just, you know, slowly transitions into elongation as the fruit sizes. So knowing that we have a very critical amount of time at the beginning to get calcium into the fruit, the biggest focus is how can I get the most into the fruit during that time. And Honeycrisp does not like taking up calcium from the soil very well. So the only option in that regard is to supplement it with foliars. And we do that every other day for minimum 45 days after bloom, which usually ends up being 60 to 75 days from bud break. So there's a lot of spraying, there's a lot of foliars during that time. Gypsum applications a month and a half prior to bloom is a good idea. Fall, I think, is better to help the moisture push whatever's available down into the root system. And I haven't seen a scenario where you can really go completely overboard with gypsum. There are a lot of concerns for, you know, sulfur getting too high. I haven't seen that in my soil tests. But I suppose it could be a reality. And then the quality of the gypsum that you're using, and how finely ground it is. Obviously, calcium is only going to get absorbed through the smallest root hairs, and the finer the gypsum you have, the better the chance of those smaller particles actually doing something, percolating through the soil and being taken up by the plant. The question of calcium is something that I've struggled with for years. And as far as I know, so has everyone else struggled with the same question. I don't think there is one specific type of calcium that is best. I think using as many as you can feasibly use that you know are effective, with backing that information up from SAP analysis results and seeing which products actually have the greatest effect, and switching between those as often as possible. Another thing would be C-stim. Having that natural cytokinin is a big part of, I think once a certain nutrient is being taken up and you're aiding cell division with something like C-stim, you're able to bring other nutrients along with it. Boron is another good example for that. I would say I probably do boron in at least half of the foliar applications that I do of calcium, because I think that is a really good way to bolster the calcium uptake, and it seems to help a lot. People also like to talk about boron toxicity. I've never seen it, regardless of how much I put on.
Almost never seen it.
Yeah. So, you know, again, what the book says about something like that may be true in a lab scenario or in very, very small areas, test areas, but I've never seen it. So making sure that the first 60 days from bud break is the most critical time for the nutrients that are hard to get to uptake. Those applications need to be done during that time. If you see bitter pit in the orchard, you cannot do anything to prevent any other bitter pit from happening. People always talk about, oh, bitter pit showing up and the apple's already, you know, a month away from harvest. Well, yeah, but the problem started before it was the size of a golf ball. And so that was your chance to do something. You're way too far gone now. But what you can do, though, is at least say, well, now I know what to do next time. And it doesn't always work. If you have a light crop load on a biennial bearing variety that doesn't like to uptake calcium, it's going to be really difficult to to get enough in there, because the distribution of nutrients through the plant to each fruit is going to change based on the total crop load. So sometimes you just can't do anything about it. Try as we do, but you do everything you can, and sometimes it works very well. And that's one of the inverse relationships. The higher the bitter pit you have, probably the lower the crop load is. You can have a really, really high crop load, and then the tree doesn't have the natural vigor that it would otherwise have with a low crop load. And somehow that enables that variety, Honeycrisp, to uptake more calcium. I don't really know the function of that. John, you probably have a lot better answer.
Well, the way we have to think about it is calcium follows the water stream, follows the water flow from the root system upwards. So when you have fewer fruit on a tree, that means you're going to have likely correspondingly more vegetative growth, because the tree is putting more energy into vegetation because it doesn't have a fruit load. And so therefore, the majority of the water, or a larger proportion of the water, is going to flow into the vegetative shoot rather than into the fruits. And that's where the calcium is going to go. It'll follow the water stream.
Right.
Yeah.
I might just add real quick. One of the big reasons we see bitter pit is from historical applications of potassium and magnesium to the soil. And people still do it to this day. People are growing cosmics and envies and honeycrisps, and they're applying potassium and magnesium at the time that this should be applying calcium. And they're just doing that based on their soil test.
I wonder who sold them that bill of goods. Yeah, more tinfoil hats here, Stephen. Beau, I have a question for you, but quickly want to follow up with the fire blight question. Stephen, I think Tia has a follow-up question, going back to her question about how do you make the decision to withdraw fungicide applications and fire blight applications. Was sap analysis a part of your decision making, or was it just exclusively field observation and experience?
I would say mostly field observation and experience, because it's really hard to take a blind shot towards something that could be such a high cost. So to jump at that blind, I think would be foolish. So by having the SAP information available, that's not going to give me things like what the cytokinin content is. It's not going to give me information on what the tree feels like or what it looks like. But the nutrients being in balance on the SAP analysis definitely can give you confidence, because at that point, you know that the tree's needs are being taken care of. And so in a way, yeah, SAP analysis results can give you the confidence to help make that decision. And fungicides the same. If you have a lot of what I call porous growth, like nitrogen-driven growth, then you have a higher surface area for something undesirable to set itself there, like fungus or bacteria. And I think those are openings for bad things to get in. We've seen that before with fire blight, where a very vigorous orchard will definitely have a higher problem and a higher incidence of fire blight than a mature tree that hasn't been driven by potassium or nitrogen driven growth. And cell wall strength, we know that calcium driven growth, calcium has, that provides the strength of the cell wall. And so by having calcium driven growth, we're able to more confidently say that's a barrier to help us prevent things from getting in that we don't want. So it's kind of a collective knowledge, I guess I would say, that the more you learn about how the physiological reactions of a tree are to fungus or bacteria, the more confidently you can make those decisions. So educating yourself on as many of these things as you can. It's not just knowing about fire blight, knowing about how the tree operates and how the nutrients move. And my education has largely come from either, the peer-reviewed research that you can find online, or it would be through talking to people like, Jason or Jim or John, and just trying to compile as much knowledge as you can so that you can put it to use.
Thank you, Stephen. Here's a question for each of you, actually, I think, but we'll start with you, Beau. A question from Damon. I started my regenerative journey over 5 years ago, and I still remember how difficult it was to regenerate compacted clay soils. What are some of the hurdles that you have run into on the beginning of your journey?
I'll go. Yeah, I do not have heavy clay soils. I'm more of a silt loam, even up to maybe sandy loam. So I do not have that. But I have water penetration problems. Even though you could say I have light soils, I can have tilled soils. I cannot get my water in the ground, and that's part of call it my regenerative path is working on soil till. So and part of it I learned is that I just have too many oxidizers in my operation, and so whether it's the plow, tillage, cultivating, or nitrate, nitrogen was a huge one, and so yeah, it's awfully strange when you go out there and you rip a field and work it up, and you apply a half inch of water and come back a half an hour later, and there's puddles of water sitting on top of the field. Yet you can physically put your hand through the soil, 6 inches deep without any effort. Yet water is just sitting pooled up on the surface and sitting there evaporating, and you're wondering why is this happening? And so it's never just one answer anyway. So here, that's why I've started switching to reduce tillage, minimize tillage, green and grow, and trying to adopt some of those principles, and then reducing nitrate, nitrogen, or my salt load is huge. And reducing my salt load of my fertilizers. And so basically no dry fertilizers, as little liquid fertilizer as possible. And then foliars is the key, where I am not affecting my soil biology. I'm not hurting my soil biology. So by not hurting my soil biology, it is increasing my soil till, and my water infiltration is gone up. And number one is earthworms. Earthworms is they call it the canary in the coal mine. As soon as you see those earthworms coming back after 2 to 3 years, and the populations from spring to fall, are getting, call it 4x, 10x of what they were, then I know things are getting better. And I have ground that is completely hard. I cannot get a penetrometer in the ground, physically cannot push it through the soil where I planted this corn, this no-till corn behind this hay. It was rock hard. When it gets everything I ever was taught to get a nice plowed field, soft seed bed, all that, it went against it. But you know what I did have? I had earthworms there, and I had the old hay crop that was senescing underneath there. And you know what? I never had a water penetration issues, even though that ground was still rock hard. Even to the end of the season, it was still firm. It is not ideal, but it had enough structure in it to take water all season long, and with with no tillage. And so that helped me a lot.
Beau, there's two thoughts that come to mind when you sharing your story. One of them is that when you have an earthworm population of 60 earthworms per cubic foot, they will generate upwards of 1 inch of earthworm castings per year. So that is kind of the ultimate tillage tool. And the second thought is, there's this forgotten word when it comes to irrigation and water management in soils, and that word is percolation. Everyone wants to talk about infiltration, but percolation is the capacity of a soil to move water both downward and then back upward. Well, guess what? When you have excessive tillage and you lose soil aggregation, you lose that soil continuity and uniform density throughout the soil column, you lose the capacity to percolate and to bring water back up that is down below. I think that's something we really have lost sight of generally in much of agriculture. Stephen, I'm going to bounce to you. What are some of the hurdles that you've encountered?
Soil compaction, I can't say that's been a huge part of my history in my area, but I'm definitely more aware of trying to prevent any type of compaction now. And one of the things that I would prefer to do too in an orchard scenario, normally you have your your drive row that has grass in it, and then a tree row that is nice and clean and bare. And I don't like it bare anymore. Number one, it gets hot. And in the heat of the summer, that's not good for the roots. So I would prefer to have even weeds growing there. That's fine, so long as they don't get out of hand. So there are some chemicals we use to try to help keep those at bay without completely killing them off. We just want to hold them back. But I think having root systems there not just helps open up the soil, but it creates, some synergistic qualities with the microbiome in that area. And then if it's an annual, then it's going to die off. Those roots will degrade. That will leave some voids, along with earthworms and other, microbes breaking things down. And then for me, the help of soil specific microbes, and then putting food for the microbes to make sure those populations stay healthy without overfeeding them, so they don't become, sugar hungry, fat little microbes that don't want to do a job anymore. It's like, no, you don't get to sit on the couch and eat Cheetos. You got to work. So I think that helps. We've tried in the row crop stuff to move more towards no-till scenarios, and that definitely helps, especially after alfalfa. The top of the soil can seem very hard. Excuse me. But even if it's hard because it's dry, as soon as you can get water back on it, everything seems to loosen right back up again because the profile is still there. So that's been a big thing for me, is using microbes and less tillage in general to try to guarantee that there are some voids left by, a dying root system after its annual cycle is done. In terms of the orchard where the drive row is and your tractor tires always are, that is a very difficult situation because, as I said, we're spraying every other day for a long time. There's a lot of trips through there, and that's going to compact it. During the fall, I go through with a ripper, and it's a small tractor, so you can't go very deep, but we're injecting specific soil microbes in the drive row behind the shanks, and going as deep as we can go with a small tractor to re-loosen that area up and to help those microbes digest whatever's there and to build that tilth back up. It only lasts for the winter, so it might be 5 or 6 months, but it's better than not doing it at all. What happens frequently in orchards is you just get these wet tire tracks and the water never goes down. And that becomes a problem for a lot of people. But being able to go through once a year and do what we do there, we don't really have any of those issues anymore. So even though those aren't maybe directly related to the fruit production, because the drive row is in better shape and there are roots from the trees that go into that drive row, it is an overall benefit, even if it's not something that's specifically quantifiable.
Yep. Thank you, Stephen. This next question, Jim, I'm going to direct it to you for your initial take, and then I'd love to get follow-up from Beau and Stephen as well. It's a question from Donnie, saying that Mr. Bierlink mentioned data crunching. What kind of systems do you use to track all this information, and is it easy to use? So, Jim, I'd love for you to just speak a bit about what's the scope of data analysis that you provide as a consultant for the growers that you work with, and then Beau and Stephen, I'd love to get your perspective on that, as well as any additional tools that you use above and beyond.
Yeah, so we're pulling sap through the season, like on apple orchard with Stephen, it would be probably 8 times, I think, is a round number that people would do, about eight saps, something like that. And then so through the season, everything's happening really fast, and we're just getting the data and giving Stephen recommendations. Then at the end of the season, we can make a line graph, which has all of the points that we've taken this data, the sap analysis, and we can track each nutrient and what it did throughout the season. And then we spent a lot of the time through the winter looking at soil reports and those SAP reports and coming up with our plan for the next season. That's the major part of it, is just kind of seeing what the uptake was for different nutrients throughout the season, and thinking about how we're going to do it the next year.
And Jim, is a lot of that being done with software in-house? What kind of tools are you using as part of the question that's being asked as well?
Oh yeah, that's just our in-house software in order to make those graphs and that kind of thing. Yeah, there's not much more than that, although we're always improving our software and our tools and things to make it better. One of the things that we want to do is have it so when you look at that line graph, you can actually kind of click on it and see what was applied at each date and that kind of thing. We're not quite there yet, but we're getting closer and closer to that. And that makes it way easier to sit down and discuss it and, click on it and see, oh, here's where we applied cobalt and here's where it came up, and here's where we applied moly and here's where it came up and the nitrates came down and that kind of thing. Yeah.
Thanks, Jim. Beau and Stephen, what are your Beau, I guess we'll start with you. What has your experience been with data analytics, and what tools do you use to manage data and do data crunching?
Yeah, so no, data analytics is key. Definitely. So you utilize tissue testing, SAP. Like I say, Jim, he when AEA, they provide a nice breakout graph of when you do the SAP and where you're at, the baselines, whether you're in high, sufficient, or short. And so that's the simple starting point, basing off that soil sample, tissue, SAP analysis. But as later on in season applications, I utilize a system called Climate Field View. It's on my iPad. Whenever I plant a crop, it is all recorded spatially. So whether all my inputs that are going on, whether the fertility, crop variety, specific seeds are recorded and spatially in those fields, and any applications I do will be recorded on the same app and all the way through harvest. And so when I do like on my corn varieties, those will be harvested with a combine, and they're all harvested spatially in the same idea. And so everything is compiled, and then so I will put all that data together from along with weather data is collected on that app also. So we are seeing the weather data and I'll call it aerial imagery data also on that. So yeah, it's a lot of data collection going on. And like Jim said, at the end of the season, when it's all said and done, we get to sit down and start evaluating the successes and the failures on what we do. But like I say, Climate Field View app is one to use, but John Deere has an operations center. If you're running John Deere equipment, that is phenomenal. That they'll record anything. There's a lot of options out there, but for me, I'm utilizing my phone and iPad to record all my data, inputs, applications, my tissue, SAP, everything is on there. So it is in my pocket. So when I'm out in the field looking at anything, I can even take pictures in the field and analyze and mark points, and then come back later and either take tissue, SAP, or soils in those areas. And so on a map, it's nice in the whole season. You can sit there and record the process. And then I like taking pictures. And early on in the season of the crop health, and mid-season, late season, and anomalies out there. You see these odd plants, different things. And so I like to take pictures and record them where they're at, and then analyze them later. Because we are so busy in season that we tend to, if we don't take care of the issue right away, it gets away from us. But at least in the wintertime, we can go back, reflect. And it's amazing with having conversations with like-minded people, and you start reflecting where you got aha moments. Says, okay, I had a similar scenario, and you can bring up a photo or data on it and analyze it. And it's a lot of fun when you can start pinpointing things going on. When you can start reading your crop, before there's serious issues, is wonderful. But it's hard to mentally keep it all in your head. So yes, data collection is key.
Stephen, you have any thoughts on data crunching?
Yeah, that's actually something that's been really difficult for me to figure out over the years, because you have to figure out first, what data do I want? And then I had a certain set of things that I thought was really important to me. And then after a few years, I was like, wait, this hasn't done anything. Okay, fine. Then throw it out and try again. So I've gone through many forms of how to do things. And in terms of digital data crunching, I mostly use Google Sheets. It's just a little bit simpler version of Excel. And the reason I use that is because it crosses all platforms and it's available anywhere. So I can I have an Android phone, so I can do whatever I want on there and view any files that I want to on there. But I've also got an iPad, so if I want to look at it on that, that's fine. And then when it's time to enter large swaths of data that I find relevant, I especially have that for the fruit nutrient analysis that I do weekly throughout the season. I'll enter all that with a desktop and a keyboard because you can move around with that so much easier. But then once all that information's in, it's still accessible on any other platform, and that really helps. So the accessibility of the information is really important. Even if I get data in a different format, I'll oftentimes transpose it to Google Sheets just so that it's all within one app. I don't want to have 5 different apps that I'm using. And I try to format them all to have the same look, even though the organization of the data might be a little different, just so that I'm very familiar with how to move around and scroll through the data in an effective way on something as small as a phone. If there's a lot of data there to look at, it might be easy to look at something on a desktop, but if it's not easy to look at on your phone, is it really that usable? So it has to be quickly accessible, and it has to be usable, something that you can, zoom in and zoom out on your phone if you just want to do a quick look. And then there's other things that I still do manually. The old auto pad, just a legal pad and a pen. And sometimes that's the best. So I have all my spray recs that I write printed, and then my spray guys fill them out manually because I don't want to deal with trying to get them to do it online. But what that does for me is I have a binder now with a backside that has no writing on it. And that binder goes with me to the orchard every time I get out and look at things. And when I ride a block or walk through a block, I will grab that, especially if it's, during thinning season, and I can write notes on that specific application. And it's for what I'm thinking or what I'm feeling is happening at the time. And that's really important to write down right then, because there are so many thoughts that can come in and go straight out that I'll stop at the end of each block and do notes on that block, and then go to the next one and then write the notes on that block. And it's very frequent that I will go back and refer to those notes. And sometimes it's a panic moment because you're like, uh-oh, I chemically burned everything off and I'm going to have no crop. Well, good. I'm glad I remembered that. But only because I went back and was able to read it. So if I didn't write that down right then, and the easiest way to do that for me is to actually put pen to paper. So everybody has a different technique for how they want to manage the information. And I think that's why it's so important for each individual to come up with their own plan for what works for them. Because if it does work for you, it doesn't matter what it is. It just matters that the information that you find relevant is easily accessible and quantifiable for what you're doing. And that may not be the case for the farm next to you. And that's okay. It's just whatever works for you.
Stephen, there's a follow-up question here from Tia on your, actually there's 2 questions directed to you, one from Tia, one from Mike. I'll offer some context because I think the way you may respond to this question might be different from what folks expect. We started working 15 years ago with a group of very sharp pencil pushers called Amish farmers in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. And they did a lot of financial analysis of their performance and their expenses and the inputs they were putting in, what revenues they were expecting. And they came up with a rule of thumb that across a broad range of different crop types and crop species, the rule of thumb is you need to spend at least 10% of your expected crop revenue on nutrition management on inputs. And what they discovered to be happening is that as growers started pushing up to the 10% and really focusing on nutrition management really intensely, all of a sudden the trend would reverse, and rather than spending closer to 10%, they would be spending a lot less. There were many farmers that went from spending 8% down to 5% or less. Not as a result of spending less per acre, they were actually spending more per acre, but because their revenue took a significant jump. They crossed the threshold where their crop performance really went up. And so Tia asked the question, if you don't mind sharing, what is your nutrient program cost per acre?
For Honeycrisp specifically, that's definitely the highest, and it's probably, I don't want to wildly overestimate because it's been a little while since I've ran the numbers, so I'm a little bit rusty. It's also, for context, something like Honeycrisp is incredibly intensive. So just in terms of management, not including product, that's a really difficult cost to quantify because I'm the one doing all the data crunching generally myself. But there's a cost to something like, say, sap analysis and fruit nutrient analysis. And I would say that's a very low percentage, probably 2%. It's very small. But as a standalone, that's as a standalone cost per acre, it's probably around $1,500 per acre per year.
Stephen, just so I understood you correctly, you're saying your nutritional inputs are running about 2% of total revenue?
No, the management of that. So it'd be sap analysis, fruit analysis, and data crunching, testing, equipment for testing. And then if I wanted to pay myself a few bucks for my own time, which it's not like I write myself paychecks, but right. if I could do all those things, I would say it's probably around $1,500 an acre. And that sounds crazy. I know that, but my total cost for something like Honeycrisp is between $20,000 and $25,000 an acre per year. And that also seems way extreme, but it's all within context. If you look at it percentage wise, and it obviously depends on if you're on an up year or a down year and what prices are doing. So everything's subjective, but my costs are generally way higher than most growers. But on a cost per unit, it's definitely lower than most growers.
Yeah, I think that's the key point. But we do have changing context, though, Stephen. We have a changing environment, which leads to Mike Omeg's question. For tree fruits and many other crops, labor is the grower's single biggest input. Stephen's every other day spray program makes me nervous when looking strictly at the expense side of the balance sheet and labor availability and profitability aside. Sometimes the labor force necessary to conduct more aggressive application programs are not available, regardless of a willingness to pay for it. Would any of you please comment about labor on your operations as you move towards regenerative practices? And Stephen, you'll go first, and then Beau, I want you to comment on that as well.
Yeah, that's it's definitely tough to make sure that you can get those applications on in time. So what we've done is we build our own sprayers now. They're pulled with a four-wheeler, and they go probably around, usually at 7 to 8 miles an hour. So that's significantly faster than most tractor sprayer combos. And they're also a lot cheaper. We can build a full setup for around $12,000. And if you think of that in comparison to an orchard tractor, even a used orchard tractor and a used sprayer, you're probably into that somewhere around 40 to 50,000. New, you'd be looking more like 80 to 90,000 for a setup like that. So that helps the cost a little bit. And then the other side of that is I'm loaded pretty heavily on tractor drivers that are able to do all sorts of other things. So even when they're not doing jobs that dictate their pay rate, it's not like The standard worker that's going to be doing low skill stuff isn't going to get paid as much. These guys get paid the same amount when they're doing those jobs. So it's finding, the multiple use type worker that you're willing to pay the same rate doing the easier jobs, specifically so that you can have them when you need them for the more important ones. So we spend a lot of time training people on exactly what to do with that, so that if we do have turnover, or if we do have somebody that can't show up for a few days, there's somebody that can come in and take their place. So there is a higher cost to those employees because of that. But making sure that they're adequately compensated for the times where their experience isn't necessarily needed, makes them available when they are needed. And I think the cost offset for not using their full skill set sometimes, but still paying them as if they were, is pretty minimal in comparison to the benefit that you can gain from doing those applications on time. So I never look at, how can I save a few bucks? It's going to be, well, if I have to spend $100 to make $100, that doesn't make a ton of sense. But if I can spend $100 to make 101, and if that makes it workable, then I can increase profit margin a little. Or if it's spend 100 to make 100, but it's more efficient, that makes more sense too. So finding ways to make each individual employee more efficient with their time is a really big deal. And sometimes that means paying more to do that. But the amount that I'm going to pay them over a year that's not going to be a huge effect. But the increase in revenue that person's labor can provide is a big benefit. So I see that as, outweighing the costs. But again, that depends on each individual scenario, the availability of labor, and how well you or a manager can get along with other people and find the right people to do the right jobs. And yeah, it's hard to do. It's not like you can hop on LinkedIn and find a great tractor driver. That's not really a thing. So it's a different dynamic here. And a lot of the culture is a lot of the worker culture for this area is Hispanic, and they have a specific culture. So my main orchard manager is great with people. And so he has a huge degree of freedom to choose who he hires and who's going to work within our system, because we really try to press that we're working here as a team, and everybody's playing their part, but we're all trying towards a common goal. And so adequate compensation and having the right people that fit for your operation. It's not just always about experience or skill. A lot of it is about the drive of the individual and what they're capable of learning in a short period of time. So there's a whole separate, conversation we could have on that, but that's kind of the mental process that I go through if I'm trying to figure out whether or not something would be worth it.
Thanks, Stephen. Beau, what are your thoughts?
No, labor is a huge consideration in ag anymore. I mean, Washington State minimum wage $15. Standard labor to get ag help is probably about $17-18, and plus we got ag overtime now. Next year will be 40 hours. Anything over 40 hours, it's a time and a half. So with overtime, so labor is huge. But honestly, going into this regenerative ag program, I think I'm going to be reducing my labor hours. It's getting harder and harder to find a workforce, but I think with being able to reduce tillage, reduce fertilizer frequency applications typically through fertigating pivots, I think I will be able to manage labor better. Most of my fertility is probably going to be sent up with a helicopter. So I will, like I say, get a fertility recommendation, put a blend together, load up a truck, send it to my pilot, and with a helicopter, and he will apply it. So it's quick, easy, and efficient doing that way. Yeah, there is an expense on the flying, but the ROI is huge. And when you look at hiring it out, somebody to get a job done quick, get it done right and fast and timely means more sometimes than us having, call it 2 or 3 more guys running around and doing it haphazardly and trying to get the job done. So no, labor is a huge influence on what we're doing, but in the call it transition period here, I believe we will be able to far more maintain our acres with less people, and that's kind of where we've gone from. Say 15 years ago, we were probably close to 3,000 acres farming with, call it 12 full-time employees, and now we're close to 5,000. So we have bigger piece of equipment. We're more efficient with it and with our time, and we're not making these unnecessary passes in our applications. So we're finding with our soils when they're getting right, we do not need to do as many passes with tillage or cultivations, or I can find the soils are more resilient and we can get by without doing them. So where in the past it was habit. We always had to do things a certain way because that's what our neighbors did, our fathers did, and we all did that. And we're finding out that with resilient soils, a plant can overcome a lot better in the long term with us not messing with the soils. And where I see in the short term, we always see this really short term gain with the plant at tilling the soils, adding the oxygen. It looks great. We feel great. But the long-term resiliency is where it's at. So,
Yep. Thanks, Beau. Jim, I'd like for you to let's go back to the budget question for just a bit. Now that you've been doing consulting work with growers and you've been with AEA for 5 years, what has been your general experience? I know there's going to be some variation from crop to crop, but what has been your general experience, and how do you see budgets shifting and evolving as growers begin implementing and adopting and using AEA programs?
Sometimes it's a wash and sometimes they save money, but it's just moving the money around. In conventional crops, it's a lot of taking that nitrogen money and putting it into micronutrients. So reducing nitrogen, putting that money into micronutrients, and then typically reducing fungicide and insecticide too, because they don't have all that nitrogen out there. And then using some of that money for biology, whether it's leaf surface biology or soil primers, fertigations, that kind of stuff. That's generally what we see.
Beau, are there any concluding thoughts that you'd like to share?
I think the main driving point is focusing on plant health and feeding the plant over, call it, mass nutrition and pesticides, fungicides. And that's what I found with you guys is focusing on that I call it even that short-term, immediate plant health, and taking care of that. And then and you guys have been phenomenal on guiding me to that path, anyways. And so yeah. So where I have been able to, let's see, on my wrinkle seed peas, eliminate most of my, I gotta say, all of my fungicides, insecticide passes with wrinkle seed peas. Just everything. You instead of insecticides, pesticides, most of this stuff you're finding out can be done nutritionally, and that's phenomenal. So why not improve the plant health and let it do its own fight rather than us trying to fight for it? And so it's been very rewarding that way.
Well, I want to say thank you to all 3 of you for participating. Jim, Beau, Stephen, thanks for being here. I want to be considerate of all your time. I've enjoyed this conversation. I hope you have as well. I hope all of our listeners have. And it's really important for all of us to stay connected, to have our own peer community to bounce ideas off of and exchange ideas. So feel free to reach out. I'm happy to introduce and connect people. You're also welcome to participate on kindharvest.ag. We have lots of fun conversations there. And if you have any follow-up questions or would like to get started working with us here at AEA, give us a call. We're happy to work with you, and we love making a difference. So thanks, everyone, and have an awesome day.